The first thing he saw was the edge itself, dark rock bitten clean out of the world, and the woman standing where the sky began. She leaned forward, as if listening to something only the drop could say. "Don't," he said, voice raw with cold uncertainty. "Don't jump." She startled. A heel skidded. Pebbles clattered into the throat of the ravine and vanished. He moved before fear could think, boots churning frost, hands closing on her coat, weight pulling her backward, the two of them pitching onto the gritty snow. His shoulder struck stone. Breath left him in a single hard sound. Her breath never came. For a moment they existed in the strange hush after disaster doesn't happen. Wind rushed and then withdrew, dragging a veil of snow with it. "I've got you," he said, and realized his knuckles were locked white in the fabric at her shoulders. She tried to twist free, not panicked, not pleading, only tired. "Please," she whispered, a word as thin as smoke. "Let go." "Not tonight." He loosened his grip but didn't release her, palms braced, as if the cliff might try again. When the tremor in her legs eased, he shifted them both a careful foot away from the rim and sat. The rock pressed through his coat. The cold climbed his spine in small, deliberate hands. She kept her face turned to the void. Snow feathered her hair and melted there. "Can you stand?" he asked. Silence answered. A sparrow beat from a scrub of juniper and disappeared into the failing light. He swallowed, tasting iron and winter. "I'm Jack." No response. The wind took his name and spread it thin over the valley. He let the quiet be. An hour earlier, before the ridge and the edge and her balancing at the end of all things, Jack Mercer had been thinking only about keeping the fire from dying before morning. The cabin's old stove breathed low, like a sleeping animal. A small frame drawing on the mantel, a house under a yellow sun with 3 stick figures, watched him with its simple, stubborn promise. He had banked the coals and listened for the sounds that told him his daughter was still safely adrift. A tiny sigh, a rustle of blankets, the click of a bead on her bracelet against the wood of the bed. Nothing urgent asked for him, which was its own kind of urgency. He pulled on his coat. It smelled of smoke and pine sap. He found one small mitten in the pocket, purple, stitched with a star that didn't align, and turned in his fingers a ritual as steadying his breath. He slipped it back in. On the table lay an envelope creased into softness by time, the writing on it familiar as his own hands. He did not open it. He touched it with 2 fingers, as if blessing a wound that would not close, and then took up the hatchet by the door. The sky had been glass blue, the color winter keeps for itself before night. The ridge path clung to the hill, stitched from rock and old deer tracks. Snow squeaked underfoot, that dry sound you carry in your bones long after. Jack walked with a particular economy of men, who must make each hour by 2 hours more. Bills he could not delay pressed at the edges of his mind. He had learned to keep them there, like lines you do not cross if you want to sleep. What he allowed in were smaller, solvable things. The way the stovepipe needed a wire to stop its rattle, the thinness of stew in a pot that would be thick tomorrow, the shoe he would mend with glue and quiet care. He cut deadfall into clean lengths, stacking the pieces with the care of someone building small certainties. Breath bloomed and vanished. The ridge offered the distant glitter of the frozen river and the dark seam of tree line beyond. Then the wind shifted, and he heard it, the hush that wasn't wind at all, the hell-breath silence of a person trying to not exist. He followed it and found the cliff and her. Now they sat with snow, finding every seam. She had the kind of coat that didn't belong to places like this. The fabric drank light and gave nothing back. Her boots were expensive and wrong for the ridge. He could feel the absence of grip in her unsteady ankles. He eased his jacket collar up and looked sideways at her without turning his head. She was not looking anywhere, which is different from looking down. There was no glassiness in her eyes. There was a clarity that terrified him more. "I have to get back soon," he said, soft. "My little girl's asleep, but I won't leave you here." Her mouth tightened at the word asleep, as if the shape of it hurt. He took the mitten from his pocket and considered the absurdity of it. He held it anyway, palm up. "It's small, I know, but it's warm." She didn't take it. He didn't withdraw his hand. After a moment she reached, not for the mitten but for his wrist. then hesitated, then settled her fingers above his pulse, as if checking whether the world still kept time. He let her. The edge waited, patient as ice. "You don't know me," she said finally. "I know you're cold," he answered. "I know you're tired. You know nothing." He nodded. "Maybe that's the point." A gust shouldered the cliff face and threw crystals into their faces. He blinked away a sting. She didn't move. "How far is it?" she asked. "To what?" "To anywhere else." He took in the slope, the crooked track, the dark smudge where his cabin stood invisible behind spruce and distance. "Far enough to forgive a slow pace," he said. "Close enough to make if you want to. If—" The word flattened between them. He breathed, careful and even, as if he might loan his lungs to the moment. Sometimes it's enough to say, "Not this minute." Her shoulders lifted and fell once. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't refusal. It looked like a person resuming the act of having a body. "Why did you come up here?" she asked. "Would." He angled his chin at the hatchet. "And because I didn't want to think about things I can't fix until tomorrow." "What things?" He almost smiled. "You're a stranger," he said. "Then you can tell me." He let the wicker of a dry grass blade snap under his thumb. Shoelaces that don't hold. A pipe that drips when it's warm. The way a child asks a question only her mother should answer, and you must answer anyway. Something flickered in her face. Something like heat behind glass. "I see," she said. He didn't ask what brought her to the edge. Answers given at the edge are rarely true. And he didn't need them yet. He needed her feet to find the ground that wasn't falling away. "Listen," he said. "If you stand, I'll stand with you. We'll walk until the cliff can't see us. Then you can do whatever makes sense in a room with 4 walls and a door that closes." She studied his boots, his coat, the fraying cuff he had tucked into itself to hide the wear. She studied his hands, raw and nicked. Maybe she imagined the cabin from these facts. The stove's soft jaw of light, the coat hanging by the door, the small bed in the small room. "Your name is Jack," she said, as if testing the sound for balance. "Jack Mercer." I can't," she stopped. She looked at the mitten, at the star that refused to meet itself. Her mouth trembled and found stillness again. "I can take 1 step." 1 step is all we'll ask tonight. He rose slowly, so the earth didn't tilt under her. He kept one hand planted on rock and offered the other. She stared at his palm as if it were a path she hadn't known was there. Wind combed the ridge. Somewhere, far below, the river shifted under its lid of ice and made the deep sound of a sleeping thing adjusting itself. She placed her fingers in his and let her weight find his arm. They stood. The cliff didn't move. It remained exactly where cliffs always are, which is to say, at the edges of people who had decided they have no edges left. 2 steps, he said, when they were both breathing normally again. She nodded. They moved back from the absence together. Feet precise, his body set between her and the place that had tried to take her name. When they reached the stunted spruce that marked where rock became path, he shrugged off his coat and settled it around her shoulders, ignoring the protest that rose on her lips. "It's fine," he said. "My house isn't far." He felt the heat of her through the jacket's lining, the ordinary miracle of another human's warmth in winter. "We'll stop if you get dizzy," he added. "We'll stop as many times as we need." Something like a laugh, thin and disbelieving, broke from her and became breath again. "You talk like you've done this before." "Not this," he said, "but I've carried small things a long way." Snow began again, fine as flour. It softened the world's hard edges. It softened theirs. They started along the path, careful and slow. The ridge fell away behind them, and with it, the last necessity of silence. He did not ask for her name. He did not ask why. He only adjusted his pace to match hers and kept his hand where she could find it when the ground turned uncertain. Behind them, the place where she stood became only a place where nobody stood now. Ahead, through the trees, a dim warmth gathered itself like a promise kept for strangers. "Not tonight," she whispered, though maybe she spoke to the wind, maybe to the rock, maybe to something old and tired in herself. "Not tonight," he answered. They walked on, the cliff losing sight of them, the dark learning their shapes, the snow deciding to fall gentler, as if there were other endings possible than the one the edge had offered. The door yielded with a sigh of hinges, and the warmth within breathed out to meet them. Jack guided her across the threshold, careful not to let the snow-heavy air follow them too long. He hung his hatchet by the door, knocked his boots against a jamb, and motioned her toward the hearth where coals still glowed a quiet red. She moved as if unsure whether she was permitted to stand on a rug that bore the wearer's small feet and wood ash. The cabin was not much, but it held the kind of order born of necessity rather than pride. The table was scarred with use. A tin pot rested at the stove's edge, steam long faded. Against the far wall, the mantel bore a handful of objects: a folded letter, a framed drawing of a house under a sun, a carved horse balanced on 3 legs. He stooped to coax the embers, adding the wood he had cut before the cliff interrupted his evening. The fire flared, painting her face with restless light. She remained standing, coat still around her shoulders, one hand holding the lapel as though she might have to flee again. "You can sit," he said, nodding at the chair nearest the hearth. "You look like you haven't seen fire in a while." Her eyes flicked from the flames to him. She didn't answer, but she lowered herself onto the chair's edge, posture rigid, as if sitting were a debt she could not afford. Jack ladled what remained of the stew into a bowl. The broth was thin, stretched across too many nights, but it was warm. He set it before her, without comment. She studied it, then him, then at last lifted the spoon. The first taste seemed to startle her, perhaps because it was plain, perhaps because it was real. He poured water from the kettle into a chipped mug. "Tea's gone," he admitted, "but it's hot." She took it in both hands, fingers wrapping around the ceramic as though she needed the vessel more than its contents. Her hair fell forward, damp from melting snow. The silence between them lengthened but did not ache. It was a silence of unfamiliar company, fragile but not empty. Through the wall came a faint stirring, a child shifting in sleep. He glanced toward the small adjoining room, listening. Satisfied, he returned his gaze to the stranger now framed by his fire. "You live alone here?" she asked at last, her voice muted but steady. "With my daughter," he said. "It's just us." A small smile ghosted across her mouth, though it carried no mirth. "That explains the mitten." He blinked. She had noticed a scrap of purple cloth tucked in his pocket when he pulled her back from the cliff. Her memory of it was sharp, though her eyes looked distant. "She's 7, he said, "smart enough to ask questions I don't always know how to answer." "She's lucky," the woman murmured, almost to herself. "Lucky." Her gaze stayed on the fire. "To have someone who holds on." He did not press her meaning. Instead, he asked, "What about you? Where's home?" Her lips parted, but no word followed. Instead, she set the mug down and brushed a fleck of ash from her coat sleeve. Her silence was an answer too heavy for language. He rose, fetched a wool blanket from a shelf, and offered it. She hesitated, then accepted, drawing it around her shoulders with an awkward gratitude. The carved horse caught her eye, and she reached out. She held it gingerly, as though it might crumble. "My girl whittled it," Jack said. "Started it herself, but the wood split. I smoothed it for her. She says it still runs, even if it has 3 legs. The woman turned the horse in her palm, thumb brushing the rough edge where the missing leg should have been. "Children forgive what's broken," she said softly. "Adults rarely do." Jack sat opposite her, the fire steadying between them. Sometimes it's the broken ones that prove the point. Her eyes lifted to his for the first time. There was something unguarded there, though fleeting, like a reflection in thawing ice. A door creaked softly. Small feet pattered across the floorboards. A little girl appeared in the frame of the adjoining room, hair tumbled, eyes wide from half-sleep. She rubbed at her face with the back of one hand, then noticed a stranger sitting by the fire. Jack spoke gently. "Go back to bed, Emily." Instead, the child padded forward, curiosity brighter than drowsiness. She looked at the woman, then at the wooden horse in her hand. Without hesitation, she stepped close and pressed her palm against the stranger's knee, as if claiming her with a child's certainty. The woman froze, uncertain what to do with such direct trust. Then, slowly, She set the horse back on the mantel and placed her hand over the small one resting on her knee. Something passed between them that did not need explanation. Emily yawned, leaning into Jack's side when he rose to lift her. He carried her back to bed, murmuring comfort. When he returned, the woman was still by the fire, staring at her own hands as if they had betrayed her with tenderness she did not intend. "She's a good judge of character," he said, seating himself again. The woman gave a small shake of her head. "She doesn't know me. She knows enough." The fire whispered as another log caught flame. Her face softened, the stern lines smoothing as warmth reached her bones. Jack watched her, not with hunger for answers, but with the patience of someone who had learned that time, given room, will choose its own revelations. Outside, snow pattered against a window, small white signatures dissolving on glass. The night deepened, drawing the cabin tighter around them. "You must think me foolish," she said at last. "No." His reply was immediate, certain. "I think you're here." Her eyes shimmered in the firelight, the tears refusing to fall but refusing, too, to hide. She turned away, pulling the blanket higher, as though it could shield her from the weight of being seen. He reached for the kettle again, poured another mug of hot water, and set it near her hand without words. The gesture itself was language enough. For a long while they sat in companionable quiet. The crackle of the fire marked time, and the wind outside swept across the ridge but found no door to enter. When her voice returned, it carried the hush of confession. "I haven't felt safe in a long time." Jack did not ask from what. He only nodded, as though she had said something obvious, like snow was white or fire was warm. "You're safe here," he said simply. She breathed in, a sound that trembled like the edge of a sob, but steadied into silence. Her hands curled around the mug again, and she leaned closer to the fire as if its glow might press her back into the shape of living. Jack leaned against the wall, watching the flames shift in colors of ember and ash. He knew nothing more of her story than when he first pulled her back from the cliff. Yet he knew enough. She had chosen, at least for tonight, not to leave. The cabin settled into its night rhythm. The slow tick of the stove, the sigh of contracting and cold. His daughter's breathing carried faintly through the wall, steady as a lullaby. He closed his eyes briefly, grateful for that sound. When he opened them, he found the stranger still awake, her gaze fixed not on the fire now, but on the child's drawing on the mantel. She whispered something he almost didn't hear. "Maybe broken things do run." The fire dimmed, but her presence did not. And though the night pressed on, the cabin felt less alone than it had in years. She drew the blanket closer and, for the first time since he'd seen her, leaned back in the chair, no longer poised to flee. The carved horse on the mantel glowed softly in the firelight, a small sentinel watching over them both. The storm outside deepened, but within the cabin a fragile warmth had begun to take root. Unsteady, imperfect, but alive. And it was enough to carry them, at least, into the long hours until morning. The storm settled in as if it had been invited. Snow thickened against the window panes, erasing the world beyond the glass, and the stove answered with a steady breath, shouldering more heat into the room. Jack fed the fire with the last of the dry split what he had carried home, shut the iron door with a gentle hand, and listened to the cabin take the warmth like a body that had been cold too long. She sat where he had left her, wrapped in the wool blanket, his coat still across her shoulders. The carved horse on the mantel watched them with its lopsided patience. Her gaze kept returning to the folded letter beneath the drawing, not greedy, not prying, simply magnetized by the idea of words that knew someone well enough to exist at all. "You keep looking," he said. "It looks handled," she replied, as if it still speaks. "It does." He lifted the letter with the care of a fragile thing and weighed the silence that followed. "Sometimes it reminds me of what I promised when I was not yet tired." She turned her face slightly, as if bracing for something that might break her further. He unfolded the paper. The creases had learned their places. They found them again now. He didn't read the date. He knew it by heart. He read what mattered. "Jack," he began, and his voice weakened and steadied. "If I'm not there when she asks for me, tell her the sky I loved is the same one over her bed, and the wind she hears at night is not empty. Tell her she can be angry and still be kind. Tell yourself the same. Keep her shoes dry. Keep your gentleness. The stove clicked in the brief stillness that followed. He had read only a piece of it, the piece the night could bear. He refolded the letter along its old seams and set it down with the certainty of a ritual completed. The woman was not crying, not exactly. Her eyes shone and did not spill. I wrote letters too, she said, to someone who stopped reading them. Did you send them anyway? At first. She glanced at the window, where the snow made a milky blur. Then I kept them in a drawer and pretended they weren't there. The drawer is full. Drawers forgive, he said. They hold without judgment. Until they don't close anymore. He warmed more water, though there was nothing to add to it. She accepted the heat as if it were a language she still understood. He set his old watch on the table and wound it with 2 careful turns. The cracked glass caught the firelight and made a small, stubborn star. The night's long, he said. We tell ourselves what we can manage inside it. She nodded, hands cupping the mug. I don't know what I can manage. Breathing counts. Breathing feels like a decision. It is. A sound rose from the small room. Emily shifting, a sigh, then stillness again. He peered through the half-open door and returned with a knitted scarf that had slipped to the floor. He folded it and placed it on the chair back, fingers lingering in a way that made meaning without ceremony. You must be used to this, the woman said, to carrying the weight of 2. I carry what's here, Jack answered. Some days it's heavy. Some days it's just a coat on a chair. She looked at the coat on her shoulders with a startled half-smile that softened almost immediately into weariness. This one saved my life, she murmured, not as a compliment to the coat. He stirred the coals, watched sparks climb and vanish. You saved your life, he corrected. You let me help. Her eyes moved to the drawing again. 3 figures under a sun, the colors dense where a child's hand pressed extra hard to make the world stay. Children draw as if nothing in the picture could leave, she said. They draw as if love is an object, he said. A roof you can color thicker if the rain comes. You believe that? I try to act like I do. She leaned forward, the blanket loosening, the borrowed coat slipping an inch. The world I came from didn't reward that. What did it reward? Winning. The word tasted like a metal coin in her mouth. Efficiency, composure, the ability to look at a cliff and say it's an acceptable risk. You sound practiced, he said gently. I am tired of being practiced. A draft found the seam beneath the door. The fire answered with a longer breath. The cabin snugged itself around the 3 of them, even though only 2 were awake to feel it. Jack took a small tin from a shelf, shoe wax, the label nearly worn clean, and set a scuff boot on his knee. He worked the wax into the leather in quiet circles. Not to impress, not to fill time, but to take part in the simple arrangement of a life that refuses to fray. The dab of wax, the slow buff, the gleam returning. These were his way of speaking without pressing. She watched his hands. After a moment, she stood, gathered the empty bowl and mug, and moved to the basin. She washed them with steady, clumsy care, unfamiliar with the rhythm but determined to learn it for a few minutes. Water hissed when he poured it off the stove into the pan, and the steam stitched itself into the room's warm air. Thank you, he said, and meant the word for more than the dishes. She dried the bowl with a towel that had been a shirt once, and then she folded the towel as if good folding might keep something together inside her as well. When did you last sleep well, Jack? He smiled without humor. When the world was simpler than it is now. And you? She didn't answer. Her silence landed like a ledger closed because the numbers would not reconcile. Wind shouldered the walls. The stove held its line. Emily appeared, hair confetti asleep, an old sweater pulled over her nightgown. She came to the hearth, blinked at the woman, and climbed onto the nearby stool, as if this guest had always been part of the room. You're awake, Jack said softly. I'm thirsty, Emily whispered, and he passed her a cup of water, cool from the covered pitcher. She drank, then turned to the woman with solemn interest. Do you like horses? She asked. The woman glanced at the mantel. I'm trying to, she said. Emily considered this answer and accepted it. She reached into the basket of pencils on the table, a stubby handful of colors worn to their last honest inches, and pulled a scrap of paper. She drew with quick, certain lines. 3 figures again, but closer now, their hands touching, a fire between them, a square window where snow fell like feathers. When she finished, she slid the drawing to the woman with the quiet pride of a person offering proof of a thing they hope is real. "For you." The woman lifted a hand to her mouth, then lowered it. "Thank you," she said, the words landing on the table like something delicate that might break if they were not spoken carefully. She traced the small lines with a fingertip. Emily leaned against her. It was not a hug, more like a lean-to trees might share in a steady wind. The woman stiffened and then yielded, the change so slight a stranger might have missed it. Jack did not. "Back to bed," he murmured, and Emily slid down, offered the woman a quick glance of absolute gravity, and padded away. He tucked her in, smoothed the blanket, and listened for her breath to lengthen. It did, and the part of him that measured danger by sound relaxed another fraction. When he returned, the woman had placed a drawing on the mantel beside the letter. The 3 figures in Emily's hand were now neighbors to the 3 named in the letter's future. The room felt oddly balanced for a beat, as if the past and the possible had agreed to share the same narrow shelf. "I don't belong here," she said, and this time it wasn't defiance. It was a soft collapse of a truth carried too long. "I break things." "Things break," Jack replied. "It's the belonging that's durable. What if I can't stay? Then tonight will still have mattered." She pressed the heel of her hand to one eye, as if a headache had moved in behind it. "You make it sound simple." "No," he said. "I make it sound possible." The storm pressed a palm against the roof and then lifted it, as if testing the house for strength. He added a smaller log, the kind that burned fast but bridged a gap until larger fuel could catch. She returned to the hearth and sat, not on the edge of the chair now, but deeper, her body letting some portion of its vigilance slide to the floorboards like a coat shrugged from tired shoulders. She took the blanket's corner and folded it once, then again, making a neat square for her hands to learn. He set the wax aside, turned the boot, and began on the other. After a while, she spoke in a voice that carried no strategy. "He called me efficient. He said it as a compliment until he didn't." "Who?" "The man who taught me winning was safer than loving." She stared into the flames until her pupils drank their red. "I'm no longer sure of the lesson." "Lessons change with weather," he said. "You found that out tonight." She looked at him, and in the looking there was a request, so small it might have been missed by anyone rushing. He did not rush. He inclined his head, a yes made without words. "May I sit there?" she asked, gesturing to the low rug before the fire. "Yes." She moved down and folded her legs, the blanket around her like a harbor. The rug's fibers pressed marks into her skin. She breathed slow and deep, then looked over her shoulder at the doorway to the small room where Emily slept. "She trusts quickly," the woman said. "She trusts with care," he countered. "She has a good sense for doors that are safe to close." The woman turned the words in her mind, tasted their shape, found them less foreign than she expected. She leaned just slightly until her shoulder found the side of the chair where he sat. It was not intimacy so much as alignment, 2 lives at an angle that did not pinch. Minutes gathered, patient as snow. The fire lowered itself to an orange bed and stayed there, faithful. In the next room, Emily murmured. The woman rose, hesitated, and then moved toward the door as if stepping into a story she did not want to harm. She paused at the threshold, listened, and crossed into the dim. Jack remained where he was, eyes on the slow heart of the stove. He heard the smallest sounds, a blanket adjusted, a whisper he could not catch, the rustle of a hand smoothing a child's hair. When the woman returned, she carried a stillness that hadn't been in her when the night began. She took the chair again. After a moment, she shifted forward, and the next time Emily stirred, the woman was there to receive her. The girl, in that blind way children choose, climbed into her lap and folded herself like a bird settling on a warm branch. The woman did not breathe for 2 seconds. Then she did, and her arms found a curve that knew how to hold. She pressed her cheek to the crown of Emily's head. In the orange light, Her eyes closed, not asleep, but to hold the feeling without it spilling out. Jack said nothing. He placed his palms on his thighs and stayed very still. The storm began to let go of the house. The house did not let go of them. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost not sound at all. I forgot what love feels like. Emily's breath answered with the soft ascent to sleep. Jack looked at the drawing on the mantel, the letter beside it, the carved horse keeping patient watch. Then remember, he said, as gently as the night allowed. She nodded, but the nod was not for him. It was for the warmth and the held weight of a child, and the room that had made space. The storm softened, the stove ticked, and between surrender and morning, 3 people sat in a house that knew enough to keep quiet. Morning arrived as though the storm had spent itself into silence. Light poured through a frost-laced window in thin, uncertain threads, catching the dust that rose from the stove's last log. Jack stood by the door, pulling his boots on with deliberate slowness, listening to the small sounds of a house that was awake but hesitant to declare it. His daughter's laughter had not yet returned to the world, and the stranger in the chair remained wrapped in the wool blanket, eyes open, watching the fire's last embers with the kind of stillness that comes after surviving a night one wasn't sure to finish. She shifted as he tightened the boot laces. "It's morning," she said, as if naming it might make it less fragile. "It is," Jack answered. His voice was soft, carrying the knowledge of how rare a morning can feel when it wasn't owed. She stood, folding the blanket carefully, smoothing its edges with her hands. There was intention in the gesture, as if putting order into cloth might help her make sense of her own edges. She set the blanket down on the chair and straightened her shoulders, her expression tightening into something practiced and distant. "I should go," she murmured. The words fell between them like cold stones, but he only nodded. "If that's what you need." Emily's footsteps pattered then, the small room surrendering her to the day. Hair tangled, eyes bright with the simplicity of childhood, she crossed the woman and, without hesitation, hugged her waist. The woman froze, startled at the suddenness, and then slowly lowered her hand to rest against the child's hair. "Stay," Emily whispered into the folds of her coat. "Just a little longer." The woman's mouth trembled. She glanced at Jack, who watched quietly, his face unreadable but steady. She knelt so Emily's eyes met hers. "I don't know if I can," she said softly. "Yes, you can," Emily insisted. Her child certainly like sunlight cutting fog. "You can because I want you to." Something in the woman's composure cracked. She cupped Emily's face briefly, kissed her hair, and then pulled away with a visible effort, rising back into the posture of someone ready to leave. Jack cleared his throat. "At least take breakfast before the road. Snow's deep and the path's long." She almost refused, but the warmth of the house, the small body clinging moments ago, and the steady invitation in his voice left little space for denial. She sat again, and he ladled what remained of the porridge into bowls. It wasn't much, but steam rose, and together they ate in silence. The woman's hand shook faintly as she held the spoon, yet she finished every bite. When the bowls were empty, she pulled her coat tighter and reached for the door. "Thank you," she said, her eyes on the floorboards. "For last night, for not asking questions I couldn't answer." Jack stood by the threshold, watching her gather herself. "Names aren't questions," he said gently. "They're beginnings. If you want, you could give me yours." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, with a breath that sounded like surrender, she spoke. "Camilla." The name filled the small cabin with weight. Jack knew it, though he had never thought to hear it spoken in his home. He had seen it on newspapers and screens, attached to photographs of charity galas and corporate battles fought with the elegance of someone who could move entire markets with a sentence. Camilla Callahan, a woman unreachable, untouchable, her face belonging to a world that had never known hunger or firewood or patched boots. And yet here she was, standing at his door with snow still in her hair, her eyes carrying shadows no photograph had ever shown. Jack didn't bow or gape. He only nodded once, as though receiving the truth of her name the same way he'd accept a forecast of more snow. "Camilla," he repeated, anchoring it gently into the room. Her lips pressed together, waiting for judgment. None came. "Names matter less than what you do with them," he said. She studied him, bewildered by the absence of awe or accusation. She was used to both. Instead, she found something rarer, an evenness that didn't flinch before wealth or ruin. Emily slipped her hand into Camilla's without asking permission. "I like it," she announced. "It sounds like a flower." Camilla let out a breath that might have been the ghost of a laugh. The morning light grew stronger, pulling across the floorboards. Outside, the ridge shone white and new, the world reset by snow's patient labor. Camilla looked at it and then back at the fire's glow, as if weighing which belonged to her. "I thought I came here to disappear," she admitted. Her voice was low, meant more for herself than for them. "But maybe I came here to be seen." Jack reached for his coat from the hook, draping it across his arm. He offered it to her, without ceremony. "Keep it. The path is longer than it looks." She touched the fabric, recognizing the gesture as something more than kindness. She held it close, then raised her gaze to his face. For the first time, she saw not just a rescuer or a father, but a man who had carved survival into steadiness, who carried grief as part of his spine and still managed to offer warmth without condition. Her hand lifted, unthinking, and brushed the faint scar along his brow. The touch was light, reverent, as if confirming that scars could be lived with rather than hidden. Jack didn't move, didn't speak, but the air shifted. The silence was no longer strange. It was waiting, like a room ready to welcome another chair. He placed the carved horse into her hand. She looked at it, startled. "Something to remind you," he said. "Broken things can still run." Her fingers closed around it, and she lowered her head, eyes shimmering in the sunlight. "You make it sound so easy," she whispered. "No," Jack said. "I make it sound possible." Emily squeezed Camilla's hand again, looking up at her with complete certainty. "Stay," she said once more, softer now, as though the word itself might dissolve if not spoken gently. Camilla looked at the child, then at Jack. For a moment, her body leaned toward the door, toward the life that waited like a stage she no longer wanted to stand on. Then she turned, slowly, back toward the fire, the chair, the drawer on the mantel where three figures already held hands under a sun. The house seemed to exhale with her decision. Jack stepped aside, giving her the space to choose. She crossed the threshold, not out into the snow, but back into the warmth. She slipped off her gloves, set the carved horse on the mantel beside Emily's drawing, and stood before it, studying the unlikely companionship of paper and wood. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "Maybe cliffs aren't endings after all." Jack met her eyes. Sometimes they're the edge of beginning again. For the first time, Camilla smiled without reservation. It was small, but it was whole. She turned toward Emily, who reached for her, and then toward Jack, whose silence was steadier than any promise. Outside, the snow melted in fragile drips from the eaves, each drop striking earth like a quiet declaration that winter yields, eventually, to spring. Inside, three people shared the kind of stillness that holds more weight than words. The fire had burned low, its glow soft as breath, while outside the snow surrendered to morning light. Camilla lingered by the mantel, fingers brushing the carved horse. Emily curled against her side, as though she had always belonged there. Jack stood in the doorway, watching, not guarding, not waiting, simply present, as if the cliff had taken nothing but given everything. Some stories don't end with grand gestures. They end like this: a house warmed by trust, a child's laughter filling the cracks, and two lives discovering that second chances arrive quietly, like dawn after storm. If this story touched you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your feedback in the comments. Subscribe for more stories of hope and second chances, and pass this one along to someone who might need its warmth.